Welcome everyone to this evening's virtual gallery talk for our new exhibit, Art Speaks. I'm Kent Whitworth, Director and CEO of the Minnesota Historical Society, and I am so pleased to welcome all of you. We are expecting nearly 1,000 households to join us tonight. The Art Speaks exhibit opened at the History Center this past Saturday and is our first comprehensive art exhibit in 15 years. It will be on view through July 31st. We are thrilled that so many of you have joined us to go inside the exhibit for this exclusive talk with our host, who will share stories about the works included in Art Speaks and will discuss what makes Minnesota art and artists distinctive. Earlier today, dozens of Minnesota history advocates from across the state and beyond participated in History Matters Day at the Capitol. This year, most of us engaged virtually, but I invite you to join us in person next year for History Matters Day. What a compelling message it would send if hundreds of us gathered at the Capitol to meet with and to thank legislators and to share why history matters so much to our own communities and to the great state of Minnesota. We'll now proceed with this evening's event. A virtual program agenda is available to you in the chat feature, and we will provide you an opportunity to have your questions answered at the conclusion of tonight's presentation. Before I briefly introduce you to tonight's speakers, I want to share that the Art Speaks exhibit is dedicated to the memory of Nina Rothschild. A groundbreaking feminist and civil servant, Nina was an architect and an implementer of Minnesota laws that removed barriers to women's economic security. She has been described as a lioness of the women's movement. Life in Minnesota and beyond is forever changed because of her strength and tenacity. Nina's passions, along with those of her husband and soulmate Ken, extended to philanthropy. We are grateful for the Rothschilds' leadership. Ken served as president of the MNHS governing board, and we are grateful for their generous support since they joined the Minnesota Historical Society as members in 1963. Most recently, they funded acquisition of the archives of Mike Lynch, whose works you will see in Art Speaks. We offer our heartfelt thanks to Nina and Ken Rothschild. Now let's meet our host for this evening. Brian Zott joined MNHS as curator of art in 2001. In addition to strengthening the permanent collection of more than 7,000 works of art, he has organized a number of exhibits for MNHS, including Seth Eastman, Artist on the Frontier, Thank God and FDR, New Deal Art in Minnesota, and Charles Beck, an artist for all seasons. Since 2012, Brian has also been head of the Curatorial Affairs Department, overseeing the staff and activities for the entire permanent collection. Before coming to the Historical Society, Brian was director of the gallery at the Minneapolis College of Art and Design for 10 years. At MCAD, he coordinated 2 artist fellowship programs funded by the Jerome and McKnight Foundations, and also curated a number of exhibitions, including Greetings from Winnipeg and Conscientious Objector, The Art and Design of Tibor Kalman. Dr. Kate Roberts is Senior Exhibit Developer at MNHS. She completed her BA in Humanities and Arts Management at Minnesota State University Moorhead. After completing her PhD in art history at the University of Minnesota, Kate led the development of the Minnesota History Center's inaugural exhibit, Minnesota A to Z. She's since been the developer for many long-term exhibits at the History Center, Mille Lacs Indian Museum, and Mill City Museum. And she has also published 2 books with M&HS Press. Welcome, Brian and Kate. Kate, I'll now turn the program over to you.
Thank you, Kent. And it's a pleasure to see so many of you here tonight. A special shout out to the artists who have joined us. We're delighted to see you. Brian, the gallery looks great. Before you introduce us to your friends there, why don't you give us a little overview of the exhibit?
Well, thanks, Kate. Nice to see you. And thank you, Kent, for that wonderful introduction. The purpose of this exhibition, our goal is to showcase the depth and breadth, maybe even celebrate the depth and breadth of Minnesota art, both in the past and in the present. There's 175 works in the exhibition featuring work by 112 artists. 50 of those artists are still living and working in Minnesota today. Having said that, the exhibition is in no way should be considered definitive. Collections like the Minnesota Historical Societies are always a work in progress, and exhibits like this are basically a status report on that progress. So let us know how we're doing, everybody. We love to hear from you.
That's great. Well, why don't you start out with the folks behind you, Brian? And you're in our faces section, I think.
That's right. The exhibition is loosely organized into 4 themes, overlapping and interlocking themes: faces, places, contemporary voices, and abstraction. So you're right, I'm in the faces section. And the best way to start a tour through the gallery is at the beginning. And I'd like to introduce you to John and Betsy Rollins. These portraits are dated about 1835. John and Betsy came to Minnesota in about 1850. But by the looks of the style of this portraiture and the clothing that they're wearing, we're pretty confident that these 2 portraits were most likely painted in New England. They have sort of a New England folk portrait style. And that the couple, when they arrived to Minnesota, brought these 2 portraits. We know that our census records tell us that they were married in 1835. So we assume that these portraits were painted as wedding portraits, and they brought them with them to the frontier town of what would become Minneapolis. We don't know much about the work from looking at them, but they're very typical examples of traditional portraiture, of what traditional portraiture is trying to achieve. They're painted in dark muted colors. The postures they're formally seated. And we don't know much else from looking at it, but upon closer inspection, you'll see the jewelry and the adornment that Betsy Rollins is wearing. She's got perhaps an ivory hair comb, necklace, earrings, and rings on her fingers. So we can assume from looking at these portraits that the couple were already pretty affluent upon their arrival to Minnesota. You'll also notice that Betsy's holding a book of poetry, so we can also make the assumption that they were educated at some level. And last but not least, their rosy cheeks indicate, rightly or wrongly, that they're in the peak of their health. And that was really one of the purposes of portraiture: likeness and some additional information. I'd now like to go to a portrait, a more 20th century portrait, and talk a little bit about that. The first work you'll see is a work by Dewey Albinson. It's a portrait of Carl Sandburg, the American poet. Why would we have a portrait of Carl Sandburg in our collection? Well, Dewey Albinson was a very important and formidable artist in Minnesota before World War II. And for that reason alone, this work would qualify for our collection. But the work comes with a terrific story. I first saw this work about 15 years ago in the home of Dewey Albinson's nephew, who at the time was probably in his mid-70s. And when we looked at this work, he relayed to me a story about when he was 9 or 10 years old on a Thanksgiving day, an impatient boy waiting impatiently for Thanksgiving dinner to be served. And just as about the time dinner was to be served, the phone rang, his father answered it, and his brother, Dewey Albinson, was on the phone, who informed him that he just arrived from Chicago at the Milwaukee Road station. Could he pick him up? And oh, by the way, I brought a friend. Well, that friend that evening was none other than Carl Sandburg. Dewey Albinson and Carl Sandburg were both Swedish-American artists and poet, and they probably circulated and socialized in the same circles in Chicago, where Dewey occasionally exhibited in the among the Swedish community in Chicago. So it comes with just a wonderful backstory and talks about the interplay between artists in a Swedish-American community. The next work I'd like to discuss is one of my favorites. It's a double portrait by Clara Mars, dated 1930. It portrays, it's a self-portrait of Clara and portrays her life partner, Clem Hoppers. The two of them were quite a well-known couple in the St. Paul art scene. And this work is one of the earliest works you see coming with a backstory or a narrative. We might not know the narrative. One person I was with this week looked at it, looked at the empty plate and the date, and assumed that the work had to do with the Great Depression and the hardships that people encountered. But there seems to be a different narrative going on, the way I see it. This relationship involved a lifelong relationship. Clara was 20 years Clem's senior. So at the time this was painted, Clara was in her early 50s and Clem was in about 30 years old. So the empty plate may symbolize that the likelihood of a family with children was not in their cards. It also, by the look on Clem's face as he stares boldly out to the viewer, is it about their relationship in more emotional terms? Either way, it doesn't matter the story, but the fact that Clara includes a narrative or a subtext in this work makes it particularly interesting. Kate, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
All right, well, thank you. There's another artist, Minneapolis's own Leslie Barlow's work is featured in the Faces section. You may have seen the portrait she's done of Vikings players at US Bank Stadium. You may have been lucky enough to see one of her solo exhibits around town. Let's take a look at a video of her talking about her work.
I'm really interested in that kind of human desire to belong. A lot of my paintings depict relationships, mostly family relationships. I'm also really interested in how race influences or entangles the intimate sphere of love, family, and friendship. Vanessa and Felix. Vanessa's a good friend and South Minneapolis community member. It's a mother-son relationship that you're seeing there. There are a lot of clues in the painting to talk about their relationship, how they're connected, how they're also individuals. What I love about that piece is how the wood grain has this ripple effect around the two of them. So you're not just thinking about their relationship, but you're also thinking about connections to their wider community, family circle, ancestors. I'm really interested in the kinds of people we typically see represented in our portraiture, the kinds of stories that are typically uplifted, and the ones that have been relegated to the margins or not historically been included. I actually asked Vanessa if she had something she wanted to contribute to the work. I was really getting into quilting at this point in my practice. The textiles that are kind of suturing them together are both found fabrics that I had in my studio, connecting to some of her grandmother's old fabrics. This little hint, speaking to history, speaking to comfort, and Vanessa's family's legacy, which is, of course, Felix's as well.
That's a wonderful video. And Brian, can you just tell us a little bit about the series that painting by Leslie is from?
Yes, I'd like to add that this work was part of a series that Leslie calls the Loving Series, and it was started in 2017 in commemoration of the 1967 landmark Supreme Court case, Loving versus Virginia, where it was decided that laws banning interracial marriage were unconstitutional. So it plays another layer relating to American history and events, and to think that that Supreme Court decision was just 55 years ago.
Mhm.
Another thing I just want to add, as of today, Leslie has just announced that she was selected to be the artist to create the 2022 State Fair poster. So it's quite an honor for Leslie.
That's a huge honor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me now talk about the works behind me. You'll notice immediately with Leslie's work and these two works that there's been a significant change in what was traditionally considered portraiture. First of all, the posture is different in these figures here. They're standing. Sometimes they're standing proudly. Sometimes they're standing not so proudly. The colors are much brighter, and the subject matter has changed. So no longer do you see this sort of traditional portraiture where the individuals are standing at a 3/4 angle from the viewer, staring blankly into the distance. You know, the work here is much more interactive. This work on my right is a self-portrait by Patricia Olson. It's titled Self-Portrait at Age 60. And in this work, Patricia stares boldly, if not arrogantly, out at the viewer. And the work has many layers, but in its essence, it's a reflection on gender and age. And we live in a culture where men appear to be peaking in their power towards age 60, where women are considered past their prime at age 60. I think it's really important to point out that Patricia has now just completed her self-portrait at 70. She does these portraits at important points in her year, and I'm happy to report it's a knockout painting. The work on my left is also quite a different departure from portraiture. It's a work by Rose Smith. It's titled, It Takes a Whole Lot of Human Feeling. And she basically takes portraiture in a whole nother direction. In the work, you see that she portrays rather anonymously 2 African-American women. We don't have much more information than what she gives us there. But we know that Rose was a resident of the Rondo neighborhood in St. Paul. And a lot of her work explores the experience of being an African-American in a largely overwhelmingly white community like St. Paul. So the title, I think, refers to the everyday burdens people must bear as they carry on in their lives. She was once quoted as saying that for her, art dusts off the burden of her soul of everyday life. It's a wonderful quote, and she is a wonderful artist who, with her husband, is living in Eagan, Minnesota.
Ah, all right. Well, thank you for those two. And I love the juxtaposition, by the way, of those two in the gallery. And you've done many such wonders. While you move on again, I want to talk a little bit about Theo Nguyen. Theo was born in Vietnam and moved to Minnesota in 2005. And he has spoken often of his love of the open spaces of Minnesota. So let's take a listen to a little bit from him.
For me, there is reverence in the simple things. Because I grew up in a war-torn country, you know, I grew up with bomb shelters in the backyard, and I have seen and experienced a lot of sadness and heartaches. So when I came here, the peacefulness of the Midwest, the serenity of it really speaks to me. Imprint 35 is about long drives and the spirit of exploration. And it's also about finding beauty in the stories along the way. I paint these things with the hope that they are not forgotten. While not always visible in my work, human lives are the primary subject. As a transplant from Vietnam, I seek connectedness to my adopted homeland. I seek to understand the people, the culture, the environment. Minnesotans continue to welcome refugees, immigrants, transplants. There is an abundance of beautiful stories here. And now that I have lived here over a decade, I think my roots settled, and my shared cultural and spiritual values are now connected, shared, and intertwined with my adopted homeland, with my community, with my beloved friends. So I continue to celebrate this.
There you are in front of Teo's painting.
Yes, indeed. You know, Teo, as you mentioned, arrived to Minnesota in his late 20s in 2005. And sometimes it takes an outsider, or in Teo's case, a newcomer, to help us see the things we take for granted. In this scene, especially in late winter, March that we're now in, these things we begin to take for granted. And so his point of view, I think, helps us appreciate the Minnesota landscape. He also talks often about the beauty that lies between the earth and the sky. And I think that's just a wonderful expression to describe Minnesota's landscape. And here we are in the landscape section. I suppose residents of every state love their landscape, but it seems to me that Minnesotans are especially fond of the Minnesota landscape, whether that's Lake Superior or the plains in western Minnesota, the falls of St. Anthony. They seem to be particularly fond no matter what the season is. So I want to point out just a few works in this section of the exhibition. And the first one I'll go to is a work by George Castone. George was born in Missouri in 1867. He was the son of a formerly enslaved woman and grew up in Colorado, and actually had the opportunity to attend college in Kansas. Upon his completion of his time at college, he embarked on a semi-professional career as a pitcher for minor league baseball teams. And his 7-year career as a professional or semi-professional athlete was well chronicled in the local pages, local sports pages of newspapers throughout the region. Upon his retirement from baseball, he moved to Evanston and got a job as a butler in Evanston, Illinois. He married, and in 1910, he, his wife, and 4 children moved to St. Paul. He got a job as a waiter at the Ryan Hotel in St. Paul, and apparently took up painting. This is an example of his work. It's a river scene, kind of classically portrayed, the gold frame, rich green colors, blue sky. This is one of a real treasure for art, because there are only 4 known paintings by George Castone. We don't know how many works he actually created, and this is one of them, and the whereabouts of the other 3 are as of yet unknown. So it's a really rare and special piece for our collection. Let's move on to some other works in the exhibition. This is a landscape work by one of Minnesota's favorite artists, Charlie Beck. He was a native and born and raised and spent his life in Fergus Falls. This work, I guess I would say that Charles Beck, nobody understands the Minnesota landscape like Charles Beck. He seems to understand the anatomy of the landscape, the bones of a landscape, if you will, in any season. And he paints his work, he creates his work in seasons. It's mostly a woodblock printer. This work is a little atypical because it's for him, because it's a scene familiar to many Minnesotans, very colorful fish houses on a lake. It reminds me of a box of candy as opposed to a fish house scene in Frozen Lake. The next work we want to look at is by photographer Tom Arndt. There are 10 photographers represented in this exhibition, and Tom is among the most well-known of those photographers. He's been taking pictures based in Minnesota and elsewhere for over 50 years. We have a number of works in our collection, but this is a work from the 1980s, and he, at this point, seems to skillfully reproduce the Minnesota landscape and the snow and the water in the early evening light. His work, we have a number of other works in the collection. He was the staff photographer for Walter Mondale's 1984 presidential campaign. And we have dozens of works from that campaign, including work from the 1984 Democratic National Convention in San Francisco. The next work I'd like to talk about is by Mike Lynch. He's one of the most well-known and recognizable artists working in Minnesota. His work, he was born in Hibbing in 1938. He was very talented, always wanted to be an artist, and was identified as a very young teenager as a child prodigy by the Duluth newspaper. When asked what would he do for a living when he grew up, he confidently said, "I will sell pictures." And that's pretty much what Mike Lynch has done for his career. He moved to Minnesota in the 1970s, and this work before you is a typical of his work. He too likes the soft light of an evening, in Minnesota. This work is painted largely in grays. He likes these sort of empty industrial landscapes or unpopulated street scenes that may include a bar or an apartment building. His work sometimes appears lonely, but there's so much more to meets the eye in these works. We have more than 20 works in the exhibition by Mike Lynch. He has contributed greatly to Minnesota identity and of its landscape. So we're very proud to have this work and others by him in our collection.
That's wonderful. There's another landscape painter that I became introduced to by working with you on this, Holly Swift, and her work, I think, is her love of the North Shore permeates her work. And I want to take a couple minutes to watch a video of her talking about that.
For me, when you're in nature, it's a sensory experience that gets really heightened. And that's what I am responding to in my work. I gravitate towards primordial areas where there is no kind of sense of man-made structures. For over 20 years, I've been visiting these same locations on Lake Superior on the boreal forest. When you go back to a place often enough, sometimes you have a moment where it's complete transformation of the place. And that's what happened in the painting of the light pool. I was high on the rocks and I'm looking out into the landscape. All of a sudden, the light shifted to blues, to greens, to yellows, and eventually into the reds and magenta. The entire space was drenched in this incredible translucent light. And the rock formations that I had seen every morning, every night, that were gray and had weight and mass, now just sort of lost their gravity and became translucent with that light falling on it. I'm just watching this in complete awe. I wanted the viewer to feel like they're in the space and a little bit be drenched in that light. I get emotional about it because it's so important in who I am and what I do. So I'm really grateful to be so close to these natural landscapes that we have here that still has that primordial experience that is still being cared for and that we still can return to.
What a gift from Holly and the other artists who shared their processes and their enthusiasms with us. Those are wonderful videos. You've moved again, you're in the Contemporary Voices section. This is a good time to talk not only about the painting behind you, but a little bit about how collecting has changed, I think.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Before we go to that, because I got to say, it's artists like Holly that make my job so rewarding and so easy. It's amazing when I see these videos, I can't get enough of them. Yeah. And they're all artists in Minnesota have the same ability to communicate their vision and their goals. Yes, we're in the Contemporary Voices section, but before we talk about the work here, thanks for asking me about the question about the collection. We have over 7,000 works of art in the Historical Society's collection, and our original mission was to document the history of Minnesota, including its people and its places. So that's what we've been looking at to date, the people and places that have helped us define what Minnesota is. But art has changed, and so has Minnesota over the succeeding years. And so today, our mission really is not only to talk about Minnesota, its people and its history, but also talk and document the history of art making in Minnesota. Every decade, there are a group of artists who excel in what they are trying to achieve in Minnesota. And today, we are the benefit of riches when it comes to artists working in Minnesota. So our mission has evolved. It's still true to its core, but we also document what other artists are dealing with that may not necessarily deal directly with people and places. And that's where we are in this section of contemporary voices. There's a variety of different artistic expressions and styles, and it's very difficult and not really beneficial to categorize them in any way further other than their visions. And one perfect example of where history and vision meet is this work by Robert Tubles. It's called The 38 Tears of Bishop Whipple. For those of you who know Minnesota history, Bishop Whipple was the first Episcopal bishop elected in 1859, first Episcopal bishop in Minnesota. Soon after his arrival, he was an advocate, quickly became an advocate of the Dakota people living in this community. And after the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862, he was instrumental in the aftermath of that devastating war between settlers and Native Americans. He was lobbied heavily, Abraham Lincoln, for leniency and clemency of the over 300 Dakota men who were held prisoner after the war had ended. And he was successful in gaining clemency from Abraham Lincoln in all but 38 individuals. And those 38 men were hung in Mankato in December of 1862. So today we might consider Bishop Whipple's efforts a success because 275 Dakota men did receive clemency from their death sentence. But imagine how Bishop Whipple must have felt not being able to gain the release of the remaining 38 men. And so here you have a portrayal of a very anguished Bishop Whipple, and surrounding him are 38 tiny teardrop-shaped nooses, each one dedicated to those 38 men who were hung in December of 1862. So it's a terrific work where history merges with a contemporary vision. When I look at this work, I'm reminded by a quote by James Baldwin, who said that history is not the past, it is the present. History lives within us all. And I think this is a perfect example where we carry our history and our community's history with us going forward. Another work in the exhibition that deals with history, but in a much more contemporary way, is the work by Carolyn Olson. It's called Grocery Store Cashier and Bagger. It's part of an essential worker series that Carolyn Olson, who's the Duluth-based artist, embarked on in March of 2020. Now, you'll recall nearly 2 years ago, we were learning all sorts of new terms: coronavirus, PPE, and an essential worker. And Carolyn, whose daughter was an employee at a grocery store here in the Twin Cities, wanted to honor those individuals who we now consider essential workers, who really held the fabric of our communities together. This is the first in that series. These grocery store workers portrayed checking out citizens wearing masks. She embarked on an additional 35 paintings depicting different professions. This particular work resonates with me because I have my 2 children are both healthcare professionals and have been in the front line of dealing with the COVID-19 crisis for many months. And so I have a newfound appreciation for my kids' work and essential workers throughout the United States.
Mm-hmm. I want to return to that point a little bit later because it dovetails nicely with the title of the exhibit. So we'll come back to that. But for now, I want to talk a little bit about Michael Carrican and his monumental work in the exhibit. He is on the faculty at MCAD, and the work in the exhibit really reflects his interest in the times in which we live. And I'll leave it at that and let him take it from here.
Usually I'm drawn to subjects that I find I have a complicated response to emotionally. Like that painting of the magnet swinging in this very graceful way and carrying this material that is like really beautiful in a way, rusty metal and stuff, and the light that was falling on it was really amazing. And then it would drop it in this big pile and be like a huge crash and dust everywhere and kind of intense and violent. Ugly in a way. So I wanted to make work that kind of communicated that sense of a kind of contradiction, the beauty and the ugliness of it. The material that I was painting in these scrapyards had reached the end of its economic life. It had value to somebody, but it didn't have its original value. It was parts and bits of these things. Everybody ends up in this pile in one way or another, or our stuff all ends up in these piles. A lot of what motivates me to make my work has to do with the sheer process of making the work, the materiality of painting or drawing. I found in the subject matter of the crane or of the scrap material a perfect vehicle for the kind of painting that I wanted to do, which was loose and kind of process-based. This painting has a lot of drips at the bottom. I just was throwing paint at it just to see how the color would mix together and create a kind of rusty effect. The movement of the crane, the sense of time passing or flux, and the gestures of the marks that I made were in response to that. It was almost like calling me, like I have to paint this.
There you are in the final section of the exhibit, Brian. You've moved one more time. And yeah,
the
go
one
ahead.
thing it reminds me, just before we leave Mike Carrican's work, his work reminds me that many contemporary artists' love for the landscape, the Minnesota landscape, is expressed through their concern for the environment and our use of natural resources and the effects of climate change. But I love how he ends his work by talking about how he loves that the bottom of this painting evolves into a rusty drips of gesture. And that brings us to this section of abstraction, where really artists are throwing all forms of representation out the window and just pursuing the pure properties of form, gesture, and color. Artists in Minnesota have been exploring abstraction since the 1930s. And the work here includes a whole range of work from the 1949 to the present. The work behind me includes work, a 1960 work by Cameron Booth, who was a very well-known Minnesota figure in 20th century. In the 1950s, he embarked on painting not objectively, painting abstract works for a couple decades. This is a classic work of just gesture and color that really is vibrant today. This work is a work dated 40 years after Cameron Booth's work, 2000, by University of Minnesota retired professor Clarence Morgan. He too explores the expressive possibilities of color and form, but in completely different ways. And I think what's additionally interesting about abstract painting is that after 75 years of artists exploring in this genre, I think it's fair to say that it's not a trend, it's not by any means new, and it's here to stay. And it's here in Minnesota, and we should celebrate those abstract artists. Last two artists I want to talk about tonight are artists who explore abstraction through their inspiration to the Minnesota landscape. This work is by Elof Wedin, entitled Knife River, dated 1957. Elof was born in Sweden and emigrated to Minnesota in early 1920s. He loved traveling and painting on the North Shore of Lake Superior because it reminded him so much of the rocky coastline where he grew up in Sweden. This work, though there's no indication other than the title, is inspired by that very location where the Knife River empties into Lake Superior, just above, just east of Duluth. So it's a wonderful abstract work inspired by a location that we can go to this day. Another work with a similar theme is a contemporary work, 2015 work by Barbara Kreft, titled Tempest. In 2015, Barbara traveled to 3 state parks in the state of Minnesota. This work was inspired by a visit to Wild River State Park, where the St. Croix River flows through that park. And after a day reflecting upon the light and the branches and the rippling water and going through the park, she created this painting in her studio. And it's a multi-layered work of art, exploring just sort of formal properties of what you might see in the Minnesota landscape.
It's wonderful. And, you know, that one has a bench in front of it. And I'm so glad because I love to sit and just let that particular painting wash over me. It's beautiful.
Well, you know, tonight we talked about just 17 works of art, which is somewhere less than 10% of the entire exhibition. So I hope by reviewing this work tonight, it'll entice people to visit because there's so much more to see.
There is so much more to see. So we've got a few questions coming in, and thank you very much, everyone. We'll keep them coming. Before we pose them to Brian, we've got a very quick message from MNHS Executive Council Development Chair, Ford Bell.
Hello, I'm Ford Bell. Thank you all for joining us for tonight's virtual event. A few years after statehood, Minnesota was nicknamed the North Star State for its northernmost location on the map. Our state motto, L'Étoile du Nord, means the Star of the North in French. The North Star is known as one of the brightest stars in the sky, a dependable, guiding light to help us find our way. In 2000, the Minnesota Historical Society introduced the North Star Circle, the Society's leadership giving program. North Star Circle provides a vital portion of the Society's annual operating budget. The commitment and generosity of our North Star Circle members maintains the excellence of our network of historic sites and museums, of our collections, publications, and educational programming. North Star Circle memberships start at $1,200 a year, or monthly contributions start at $100. In recognition of their generous support, North Star Circle members receive special benefits, including invitations to exclusive North Star Circle events, behind-the-scenes opportunities, special access at historic sites, and private tours with Minnesota Historical Society curators and collections staff. I invite you to consider joining the North Star Circle Leadership Giving Program by committing to a monthly gift of $100. Your support will help us preserve Minnesota's past, help us share our state's powerful stories, and help us connect people with history for generations to come. North Star Circle memberships are 100% tax deductible. Become a North Star Circle member now by calling Carrie Ann Genrich at 651-271-7782 or by emailing us at northstarcircle@mnhs.org. Join the North Star Circle and become a guiding light for the Minnesota Historical Society and Minnesota history.
That was terrific. Look at you. You've moved one last time. Looks like you're settled in for a while. So, Brian, do you have anything you want to, any kind of summing up here before I go to a first question?
Well, actually, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you for tonight's hosting this event, but I also want to thank you and your crew in the exhibition department for helping organize this exhibition and for literally keeping the guardrails up as we progressed during this exhibition. It's a group effort here. There were many departments involved in putting the show on. It is many staff have participated in it, and I'm grateful to each and every one of them. And I also want to thank the crew here tonight who has worked so hard at putting this great production together. So thank you all.
That's lovely. And it's a pleasure. It's been a pleasure working on this. So let's get to some questions. The first two that came in were about George Castone. So let's take both of them. The first one, Cecily asks you to talk a little bit about the acquisition of that painting. And the second from Collis Larkin says, how do you know that there are 3 other paintings? Is there an exhibition listing?
Yeah, those are 2 great questions. You know, George Castone came to us through a gallery in town. You know, we look for, we receive works of art in 2 ways: through donations, through generous donors who pass on their work to us as a collection, as a donation. And we have an acquisition fund, which allows us to purchase, to fill gaps in the collection. So when this particular work became made known to me, it wasn't long before I rushed over and acquired this work because of its rarity. I know that there are 3 other titles. One is if you go online and actually search for George Castone, you will get a self-published book on George Castone, mainly about his baseball career. But that author had identified this work with, in the show that's on the cover of his book, and one other that was in the collection. And then we have research documents here at the Historical Society that lists exhibitions that artists have participated in. And we know through that George Castone participated in an exhibition, the annual exhibition of Minnesota artists at the Minneapolis Institute of Art in 1922 and 1923. So that gives us a total possibility of 4 titles by George.
Right, thank you for that. And you sort of anticipated a little bit the next question, which you could talk about this for 20 minutes, but I'll ask you to do it in about 30 seconds instead. How do you determine what pieces to acquire?
Yeah, well, you know, that is a 20-minute answer, but working in this career for nearly 35 years, you go to exhibitions, you meet with artists in their studios, you talk to gallery directors, you start to put together a chronology and a history of art making in Minnesota. Plus, I had the benefit of having a predecessor who had been at MHS for 20 years before I arrived, who really put together the fundamentals of this collection. So gave me a lot to start with as I moved forward. So again, you look at it, then you have to evaluate what's being offered to you, how it fits, how it tells the story, and what we need to complement that story through acquisitions, other acquisitions.
Thank you. That's really helpful, Brian. And I do want to say your predecessor, since there may be some folks who remember him, Tom O'Sullivan. So wonderful man. I was lucky enough to work with him on several exhibits too. So we have a question here from Eileen Roberts. I wonder if she's any relation to one of us. She is asking us if we can see other items from the art collection at sites or in the History Center.
Well, you know, like every museum, what is on view is sort of the tip of the iceberg of a collection. As we mentioned at the outset, we have 7,000 works of art. Fortunately, almost all of those works of art are available by coming to our website and going to our collections online website and searching through a variety of different search word terms of what might be in the collection. So it is available at least virtually.
Mm-hmm.
We often, that brings up a really good point about how this collection gets used. Not only do we have standalone exhibitions like this, works are also included in other exhibitions to illustrate a story or an example. So exhibitions that you have worked on have included works of art from the collection. We also loan works of art to our sister museums. So in the past couple of years, we have lent work to college galleries, university college and private college galleries throughout Minnesota. We've also currently have a work of art by Cameron Booth on loan to the Phoenix Art Museum. And lastly, the collection gets used through research. People go online or are doing research and then leads them to the collection based on the topic. And the curators here at the Historical Society meet with researchers all the time to explore different aspects of our collection on a one-to-one, and of course through our library.
Yeah, yeah. And you're all extremely generous with your time in working with researchers. I know that that's very much appreciated. Stephen Nelson asks if we have any works by Faith Lowell in our collection.
Yes, we do. Faith is another one of these great artists who a landscape painter, and we have work by her as well as others. You know, this exhibition focuses on acquisitions of the last 15 years. And in that 15-year period, we acquired something like maybe 12 to 1,500 works of art. So from that, we get 175. So there's lots of artists, even recent acquisitions, that we couldn't feature in this particular exhibition from our collection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Another one of our old friends, Andrew Fox, asks if you've included any George Morrison paintings in the exhibit.
Yes, indeed. Behind me, you might be able to see 3 George Morrison works. 2 of them are dated from 1959, which is just a very important time for George Morrison. He had been in New York City for almost a decade. His career was really taking off nationally at that time, and his work, he had reached a sort of breakthrough in his work. So to have not 1 but 2 works by George Morrison from that year, 1959, it's pretty extraordinary. We have an additional work, a later work, where it acknowledges the fact that George and his family returns to Minnesota in the 1970s, so he could be closer to the landscape he identified so dearly with, and that's the landscape of Lake Superior and the horizon line that the lake is formed by the lake. And the third work deals with that notion of the Minnesota landscape of Lake Superior.
All right, thank you. And also Andrew asks about other Native artists, and I'll just say Julie Buffalo Head, Gwen Westerman, and of course Jim Denemy are all represented.
Cole Red Horse Jacobson is also in the exhibition. So a number of Native American artists. This is an area since I've arrived, we've paid special attention to. Traditionally, when people thought of contemporary Native American art, they naturally thought of art of the Southwest. And I've always contended that actually the Native American artists of the Upper Midwest are a far greater and more talented group of artists.
Yes, I agree with you 100%. Okay, folks are anxious to hear a little bit more about the setting that you're in. Yes, that's a Biederman behind you. And tell us a little bit about the wonderful sculpture.
Yeah, well, first about Charles Biederman. Charles Biederman came to Minnesota as a mature artist. He moved to Red Wing, and that work too is inspired by the landscape. It's a very abstract work of these 3-dimensional planes coming off a surface, and the light that is the shadows that are cast as a result of the light. But he was inspired by the light shining on the bluffs over Red Wing and how it constantly changed. The shadows were constantly changing. And so it was his observations of the bluffs above Red Wing that inspired his very abstract and austere work. And of course, the work behind me is by none other than Rochester-based artist Judy Onofrio. This is a work typical of her work of the last several years. It's a mosaic sculpture of found objects, remnants. She would visit thrift shops, junk stores, yard sales, and collect all sorts of things to create these wonderfully exuberant 3-dimensional sculptures. As you may know, Judy is as exuberant as her artwork. But as of late, the last several years, her work has taken a different turn, and she's working with animal bones, a monochromatic work, very austere, equally beautiful, but in a completely different direction than the work behind me.
Oh, that's great. I want to say we're really having a lot of great questions here. So we will keep going, Brian, if it's okay with you, until about 8:10. So let's keep charging ahead here with our questions. We have a lot. I can't guarantee we'll get to all of them, but we'll do our best. Alexis Fournier. There's one by him in this exhibit.
Yes, there is.
Right?
In fact, we have a landscape. Alexis Fournier and Nicholas Brewer were 2 of the best known late 19th, early 20th century landscape and portrait painters. They each had a studio in the Twin Cities. Alexis Fournier left and settled in southern Indiana at an arts and crafts colony called Roy Craft. Nicholas Brewer also traveled extensively, but focused mainly, stayed mainly in the St. Paul area. We have a portrait of Alexis Fournier by Nicholas Brewer, which is again a great sort of juxtaposition of one artist paying tribute to another artist, and of course a great landscape by Alexis Fournier.
Yeah, great, thank you. Jonathan asked if there's a catalog available for the exhibit. No, there isn't, but that's a very good suggestion. Thank you.
It is a great suggestion.
Yeah. Yeah. We have a question about Warren McKenzie's pottery. I'll say that Nancy McKenzie has a work in this show. And then Brian, maybe you can explain about the pottery collection.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm
is.
glad you brought that up.
Mhm.
You know, this collection, as I said earlier, was founded really at the founding of this organization in the 19th century. And in the 19th century, art as a collecting area was defined as what we would consider today as fine art: painting, sculpture, works on paper, and the addition of fine art photography. But in our other collections here at the Historic Society, we have an extensive collection of craft material like Warren McKenzie's. We have a lot of work by Warren and many potters who have been inspired by Warren McKenzie. So our collections, and of course, I don't want to dismiss our quilt collection, which is also extraordinary and many consider works of art.
Yes, absolutely. Eugene Larkin, Bonnie asks about him.
Indeed, he's in the show, taught both at MCAT at the University of Minnesota for many years. He's one of my favorites, and we have a beautiful print inspired once again by the Minnesota landscape.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Marta says that we need a road show to give better access to our art. I'm in. I bet you are.
I am too. Pull up the semis.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, Nancy has an interesting question. Do you collect folk art, including scenes of activities such as threshing practices?
We have just a couple examples of folk art in our collection, especially the fine art collection. And there's one work in the show here by Andrew Stenstrom, who painted homesteading farms. He was an itinerant preacher, and to pay for his bills when his preaching didn't pay for his bills, he painted farmhouses and farmsteads throughout Minnesota. And that work has a great sense of folk tradition in that. And we have a few other rare examples of that in the collection.
Yeah, great, great. Monica asks if, I love this, Sid Fossum, one of my favorite artists.
Well, I will confess, he's one of mine, and we have 4 Sid's work in the collection. He shows up in a couple different places. In our landscape section, we have 2 prints by Sid. He chose to portray a grittier side of the Minnesota landscape by depicting factories and densely urban neighborhoods of his time. We also have, he was a great sort of observer of social and critic of social environment, social situations. And we have 2 wonderful figurative works by him. One, which is a group of individuals at an art opening, not necessarily flatteringly portrayed. And then we have a 1936 work by Sid, where he depicts all of the practicing artists at work, active in 1936, and giving them little attributes as to what their occupation was. It includes Clem Hoppers, A.F. Wadeen, just a number of artists, Earl Lauren, just a great illustration, almost a illustration on what was going on in Minnesota in 1936 or 39.
Yeah, it's a really fun work, and it's quirky. It's almost Thurber-esque to me. I mean, it has that real whimsical look. And like you say, when you compare that with other works, you see his range of styles. Yeah. But back to the questions. Katie asks about fiber artists in our collection. We do.
Yes, we have a lot of artists in the collection, especially that ends up in our, again, our textile collection, which is housed inside our 3D collection. So there's no end to the depth of our collecting areas in some of these other practices.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Adolph Dane. Robert Becker
Eight.
asks.
Yep, Adolf Dane. We have probably one of the largest collections of Adolf Dane's work. Most of that work, if not all of it, was acquired prior to the 15-year sort of time frame that we put on this for this exhibition, the parameters that we arranged for this exhibition. So Adolf Dane is not in this exhibition.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that. Remind us of the title of the Judy Onofrio work.
That work is entitled "Your Wish Is My Command." And on the back, you have depicted a little genie standing on a pillow with his arms crossed. And in the front, you have a woman in an easy chair reaching for her phone about, I assume, to make her wish.
I would imagine, yes. David asks about WPA artists in the exhibit and in our collection.
Yeah, we have a few examples of WPA work in the show. That was a period of time from about 1935 to 43, where the federal government employed artists to create works of art. And it was basically a jobs program. And it is a wonderful example where the visual arts and American history merge. And a number of artists in Minnesota were employed by that program. One of the youngest of that group was an artist named Dorothea Lau, who is represented in this exhibition. She is a rare female artist in the WPA program. There were many women artists participating in other aspects of the New Deal programs, but the WPA, you had to be, as I understand it, you had to be unemployed and head of household. So it was very difficult for women artists to qualify under that program. But nevertheless, Dorothea Lau did qualify. She's a bit of an enigma in our collection because after the WPA ends, she disappears. We don't have any idea if she continued to make art. Did she marry and did her name change? The last recorded movement of Dorothea's work is taking a job with Northwest Airlines.
I find that fascinating. And, I think so many of us have these little projects that we want to take up, our little research projects. And she's one of them for me.
Yeah.
But if there are any aspiring art historians out there, the whole idea of women in the WPA is ripe for further study.
Many of those women end up being muralists because that program was a different program. So actually women artists took up muralism.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. Yeah. John asks about Solveig Arning Johnson. Is that a familiar name to you?
It is not a very familiar name to me. I love learning new names of artists that come across in my attention. I get inquiries all the time, and I'm always loving to learn more about the collection.
Yeah, so that might be one that we can follow up with later on that. Yeah, this is a good question from Jan. Do we collect Minnesota illustrators, for example, children's book artist Nancy Carlson?
Yes, we do. In fact, we're just acquired a couple illustrations by children's books illustrators in a collection. Of course, the books are recorded, like Wanda Gog, who was one of the first children's book illustrators from Minnesota, who did Millions of Cats. We have all those editions in our library. So we collect them often through their publications.
Yeah. Thank you for that. How about, this is a good question. A number of us have seen the advertisement with that beautiful portrait. Can you just say a little bit about that work?
That's a wonderful portrait that came to us as a gift from a fellow who was a good friend of Barbara Cyrus. Barbara Cyrus was sort of a fixture in Minnesota. She was a columnist for the Minneapolis Spokesman Recorder for a number of years. The donor of this work was given that painting from Barbara Cyrus herself. It was painted when both Barbara and the artist were both very young, in their 20s. The story goes that the painting was commissioned by Barbara's father, and Audrey Freeman, the artist, was a student at MCAT at the time. So it's an extraordinary portrait of an African-American woman from 1934. Not very big, not as big as the advertisements that we use in the advertisements.
Yeah. Here's another artist whose name I'm not familiar with, Clint McKenzie.
That's a new one, another new one. That's great. That's why I say it's the exhibitions are works in progress, report cards. And so this is a great feedback to get names of people that I should continue to research.
Yes,
research on it.
so Bonnie, we will follow up. Jeannie asks about the 15-year time frame. That's 15 years of recent acquisitions, right?
Yeah, that's how we define recent. And the reason we chose that really is because we've been so active over the last 15 or so years that we wanted to showcase work that has rarely yet been seen in a gallery setting like this. So that was the one reason for putting some parameters on the exhibition. Also, we wanted to demonstrate some of the recent developments in collecting. And one of those is that we're getting, over that 15-year period, we've got a number of artists donated who are still living. And that's rare for our collection, and it's a new development. Originally, we would get works of art that were inherited or came from estates of a grandparent who maybe bought that work 50 or 75 years ago, who have passed on, and now whose family is now looking for a new home for that work. So traditionally, we had this arc of time, 50 to 75 years. But in the last 10 or 15 years, as many of us are acknowledging that baby boomers are downsizing, and they have been great accumulators of art. And they too are now looking in their own lifetime, looking for homes for their art collection. So it's a really recent phenomena that's very interesting to me, because it's changing the direction and the nature of our collection in its entirety, where we're collecting more and more work by living artists.
Ah, I see. All right, we have time for one last question from Eleanor Gilmore Zott, someone again you might know. What do you hope viewers will take away from this art, from the show, and from the last hour, and ultimately share with their own communities?
Oh, that's a terrific question. Hi, Ellie. How you doing? Listen, we titled this exhibition Artist Speaks because it not only can a work of art tell a story about the artist or about the sitter, it's about the stories that we bring to it and about the stories the artists bring to us. So in a way, it's sharing community experience, community history. Thomas Merton once said that in a work of art, you could at the same time lose yourself in a work of art and also find yourself in a work of art. And I really hope, that's what I hope this exhibition will do, is that people can find something about themselves and learn something about their history and the history of some of the people who are represented in this exhibition. So thank you for that question. I didn't plant it, but I loved it.
You raised her well. Well, thank you, Brian. It's been a pleasure.
Yes, I'd like to close by just one more expression of gratitude. I couldn't have done this job if it weren't for all the artists, both still on this earth and who have passed, who have made my job so rewarding and so satisfying and gratifying. So thanks to all the artists who really distinguish and make Minnesota proud. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. And so this has been a great conversation, and to all of you, to our donors, to our members, to our artists, our volunteers, our invited guests, thank you for coming tonight. Once again, I want to express my deep appreciation to the major donors and collaborators who made this exhibit possible. Come and visit early and often. You can also find art books, resources, supplies in our museum store and online. So go to mnhs.org/shop and see lots of interesting things that will supplement your enjoyment of this exhibit. As we say at MNHS, History Matters. If you enjoyed this evening's program and would like to learn more about the North Star Circle and how to support the ongoing work of MNHS, do visit mnhs.org or call Carrie Ann Jenrich in our development office. One final note before we end. This week, we lost a friend. We lost a Minnesota treasure. We lost a giant in the art world, Jim Denemy. 3 of his paintings are included in the MNHS art collection, and 1 is currently on display as part of the Art Speaks exhibit. All of us at MNHS are keeping Jim's wife, Diane Wilson, their children, and their wide circle of family and friends in our thoughts and prayers. Thank you all for joining us. Good night and take care.